Hello everyone, and welcome to yet another episode of Real History. I'm history professor Jared Frederick, and tonight we have a very special film to me lined up, and that is the 1993 Ronald F. Maxwell film, Gettysburg. And I saw this movie when I was in about first grade, and it was truly this movie that inspired me to pursue a career in history in the first place. And as was the case for many history buffs around my age, this was a film that really spurred their fascination with this very tumultuous time period that was the American Civil War. About a year after I saw this film, my parents took me on my first trip to Gettysburg National Military Park. 15 years later, I found myself working at Gettysburg National Military Park as a park ranger. And so perhaps I will share a few anecdotes from some of those adventures as well. For those of you tuning in, you're in all likelihood very familiar with this movie. It's a very celebrated one, and it's shown in classrooms all across the country to this very day, thanks in no small part to the fact that it's rated PG, and it's very accessible to young people in the classroom as a result. And in some circles, though, it has the very dubious distinction of being the longest American movie ever made, clocking in at over 4 hours in length. And the reason why that it is such a long movie is because it was originally envisioned as a mini-series that would air on TNT. I also had the opportunity to introduce this film on Turner Classic Movies for that channel's 25th anniversary. You can find that video on YouTube as well if you'd like a more condensed form of our presentation this evening. But despite a lot of the nostalgia that I have for the movie Gettysburg, that will certainly not spare it from certain levels of historical scrutiny that we will be getting into as well. Because this movie is such a long one, we are going to do this film analysis in 3 parts, one for each of the 3 days of the Battle of Gettysburg, and we hope that that'll make it a little bit digestible for all of you viewing from home. So let's go ahead and dive right in, 1993's Gettysburg.
The Confederate Army of Northern Virginia, Robert E. Lee commanding, slips across the Potomac to begin the invasion of the North.
This geographic orientation at the beginning of the film, I think, is quite helpful for viewers who were perhaps less familiar with the Battle of Gettysburg than your average Civil War buff. We get a sense that the war is by and large taking place in Virginia, that this incursion into Pennsylvania is more of an anomaly more than anything else, setting up for why it is so significant.
General Lee knows that a letter has been prepared by the Southern government, a letter which offers peace.
The narrator points out, though, this promise or this pact which will offer peace to President Lincoln, and it's to be placed on his desk after the Army of the Potomac is defeated somewhere north of Washington. There was not really a letter such as that existed. That was incorporated here undoubtedly to add some dramatic emphasis for the high stakes that were in fact on the table. In these opening shots, we also see Federal cavalry on the move northward. And it's important to point out that just a few weeks before the Battle of Gettysburg, on June 9, 1863, Confederate and Federal cavalry engaged in one of the largest, if not the largest, cavalry battle of the American Civil War at Brandy Station, Virginia. And that in many ways was the opening salvo of the Gettysburg campaign, and of course things would only escalate from there. Cavalry was very important because in many ways it was an Army's GPS system.
Where are you headed?
General Longstreet. I gotta see the general.
Is that a fact?
I know General Lee has his headquarters up here a little ways. Wherever he is, General Longstreet is nearby.
It's very safe to assume that not really any Confederate soldiers looked like this Pickett that we see on duty here. By the summer of 1863, your average Confederate infantryman was a a really lean, tough young fella in most cases, and not this Uncle Joe looking character off Petticoat Junction who we see here skulking in the woods. So that's the fair inaccuracy right off the bat as we get started here.
Harrison is back. The scout, Harrison, sir?
The scout, Henry Thomas Harrison, was a real-life scout for the Army of Northern Virginia. There are many different stories behind his life, some of them somewhat apocryphal. But the evidence seems to suggest that Harrison, for a good spell of his time with the Confederate Army, he had been recruited by the Confederate Secretary of War, James Seddon. And as some of these conversations would indicate, he was often paid in gold for some of his activities. And here in late June of 1863, he made his most important discovery of all. And that was the fact that the Army of the Potomac was on the move northward. It was not until after the Confederate Army had crossed the Potomac River and moved into Pennsylvania that Confederate Commander Robert E. Lee was even aware that the Federals were pursuing him. And so this discovery on the part of Harrison was indeed a rather substantial one.
The 6th right behind, supported by a column of Federal cavalry, 7 corps altogether. The 1st and 11th.
The map that the characters here are looking at is a reproduction of an actual map of Adams County, Pennsylvania, and it was really one of the only maps that the Confederate Army had at their disposal as they were moving into south central Pennsylvania. And some of the officers and scouts, they were ripping down this map off of saloon walls or finding them in public spaces, and they were taking them and making use of them. And that was really one of the only visual cartographs that they were having at their disposal as they were involved in this incursion into Northern Territory.
General Stuart would not leave us blind.
Oh, one other thing. Hooker's been...
As we see this opening conversation with Generals Robert E. Lee and James Longstreet, I think in one regard where this movie really excels is that you see the burden of command that is placed on some of these officers and generals. Lee had been, hard at war. He'd been commander of the Army of Northern Virginia for over a year by this point. He had taken it on to some of its greatest victories, but this came at a dreadful cost. And if you had a death sentence, there were really few better places for you than Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. We see this war of attrition just escalating. And the Confederacy cannot replace their men at the same level that the Federals can. And so, in so many ways, this campaign into Pennsylvania, happening simultaneous with Ulysses Grant's campaign to capture Vicksburg, Mississippi and gain control of the Mississippi River. This was, a high stakes moment for Robert E. Lee. And as he has these conversations with, his old warhorse, James Longstreet, you really get a sense of that tension that was clinging to them at that desperate moment.
Colonel Darling, rise up, me bucko. Oh, I'm sorry, darling, but we got a bit of a problem here, Colonel.
This early morning conversation, we are introduced to two of the most notable characters in the film who have a very unique and telling character dynamic between them. One of them is a real-to-life figure, and the other one is completely fictional.
But to be having them as guests.
What?
Yeah, should be here any minute.
Who?
Mutineers.
The officer who we see being roused from bed here is the commander of the 20th Maine Infantry by the name of Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. And it was an interesting choice on the part of the Killer Angels author Michael Shera to pick Chamberlain to be the main protagonist from the Union perspective. And I think two reasons why Shaara was drawn to him is one, is that Chamberlain was a professor, much like the novelist, and Chamberlain had a gift for writing. And he left a very vivid account of his experiences in the war, and particularly in the Battle of Gettysburg itself. And so that was some very rich source material for a novelist.
Being as we are the only other main regiment in the 5th Corps, so they've been assigned to us.
Chamberlain's sidekick is an Irish immigrant sergeant who fought in the Mexican-American War. His name is Buster Kilrain. And Buster Kilrain is one of the few fictional characters in both the novel and the film. For Michael Shaara, this was a way for him to kind of insert himself into the story. And the likes of Buster Kilrain, like some other characters who will be introduced to a little bit later on, is a very unique literary and cinematic device that allows some of the main characters to explain themselves, how they are feeling, what they are thinking, why they act in the manner that they do. There's a Confederate counterpart on this point, and we'll be introduced to him a little bit later.
It's a good time of day. I always do enjoy this time just before the dawn. When all this...
One of the points of ridicule that we often see in this movie among some of its more faithful viewers is Tom Behringer's beard. It is not a very good beard, cosmetically speaking. It kind of looks like roadkill that was glued to his chin. And I met an extra who was in this film, who was very much active in the production of this motion picture. And I asked him once, what was the biggest challenge of bringing the Battle of Gettysburg to life on the big screen? And he said, in a heartbeat, Tom Behringer's beard. That was the most difficult part because it kept falling off.
It's limbo with his feet.
Morning, Lawrence. How are you? You're looking kind of peaked.
Darn it, Tom, don't call me Lawrence.
Joshua Chamberlain's family did refer to him as Lawrence. But we can see here, with the introduction of his younger brother, Tom, that his little brother did not always abide by that level of formality. Whether Chamberlain in real life was annoyed by that is open to speculation. What a lot of viewers don't realize, though, is that there were actually 3 and not 2 Chamberlain brothers involved in the Gettysburg campaign. The third brother was John Chamberlain, and he was a member of the United States Christian Commission, a predecessor of, the American Red Cross, essentially. He was a civilian aid worker, and he happened to be, following the Army of the Potomac, offering his services as such, and it just so happened that he joined his 2 brothers and the 20th Maine as they were embarking on their greatest chapter of fame and heroics. But he is completely omitted from both the book and the film.
Go ahead. Why don't you sit down, Mr.
Buckland. Joseph Buckland. Listen, Colonel.
One of the really interesting points about the casting of Jeff Daniels is that there were a few runner-ups to star in the role of Chamberlain. And among those actors who almost got the role was a young up-and-coming Australian actor by the name of Russell Crowe, who came in a close second place. And so it's really interesting to think of this alternative pick in the form of Russell Crowe, who was only a few years away from megastardom himself. So who knows what course his career would have taken had he been chosen for the part instead of actor Jeff Daniels.
It's a sick-brained, pot-bellied scarehead that ain't fit to lead a Johnny detail. They ain't fit to pull a pea out of a boot with instructions written under the heel.
This frustration on the part of Joseph Buckland, it was something that was very real. It was palpable. In certain regiments, there was this very real frustration and anxiety of a lot of these men kind of being thrown through the meat grinder, enduring defeat after defeat at the hands of generals who, took them through these various losses. And so, for the troops in the Army of the Potomac, this forthcoming campaign that would be fought on northern soil, fought above the Mason-Dixon line, in many ways, it would offer them a chance for redemption. And perhaps even more so, not only a chance to turn back the Confederate tide, but perhaps change the tide of the war itself. And certainly, these were the things that were on these soldiers' minds.
Well, that's different. Generals can do anything. There's nothing quite so much like God on earth as a general on a battlefield. So
that line was originally going to be the inspirational title for this book. This book about the Battle of Gettysburg was almost entitled Gods and Generals. But ultimately, a different title was chosen. The book was called The Killer Angels instead. And about 2 decades later, Michael Sherr's son, Jeff, would use that title of Gods and Generals to write the prequel to The Killer Angels. And that movie would also be adapted into a film 10 years after Gettysburg. Or perhaps we'll explore that film at a later point.
from here to the Pacific Ocean, no man has to bow, no man born to royalty. Here we judge you by what you do.
Chamberlain's speech is one of my favorite moments in the film. Not only is it superbly acted and delivered by Jeff Daniels, but it really gets to the heart of the perspective on the part of Union soldiers. Because we're offered two key elements here in this speech. On one hand, Chamberlain underscores the importance of a people's union, the idea of representative government, preserving the country that was established by the Founding Fathers some 80 years earlier. That was something most definitely worth fighting for. Chamberlain hailed from an abolitionist family, and contrary to popular belief, most Northerners were not hardcore abolitionists. And even many abolitionists did not advocate for civil rights in the manner that we might think. However, many Northerners felt that slavery was a supreme wrongdoing. They believed that it was a counter to the notions of democracy. They believed that slave powers had a grip on the federal government ever since the government itself had been created, and that this country needed to be made anew. We needed to have, as Abraham Lincoln would later call it, this new birth of freedom. And that is exactly what Chamberlain's character is getting to in this film. And in so many ways, these are ideals that had never really before been presented to audiences when they walked into movies about the American Civil War. And so when I talk about the Civil War in cinema in some of my various classes, this is the scene that I often show my students because it's a very important and also profound one. As we see the 20th Maine depart its encampment, it's important to point out that almost the entirety of the cast for this film in the form of extras was comprised of Civil War reenactors. And Civil War reenacting was at the height of its popularity in the late 1980s and in the early 1990s. And reenactors turned out in droves to participate in this film, somewhere between 5,000 and 8,000 of them. They brought their different uniforms. You didn't have to equip them. They came fully equipped. This movie would not have been possible without reenactors. It's important to point out as well, as we see the arrival of John Buford's cavalry in these scenes, that the entirety of this movie was filmed in Adams County, Pennsylvania. It was all filmed on or near the actual battleground, which is just something we don't see in a lot of historical films. And it just adds this rich ambience and texture to the film and the film would have been so lacking, I think, if it hadn't been filmed in Adams County, which is still a largely agricultural community, even with all the tourism of today. And here we see, some orchards. There's still a lot of orchards to be found in Adams County, and it just sets the scene perfectly. A lot of these scenes were filmed in the vicinity of Fairfield, Pennsylvania, which is just a few miles outside of Gettysburg. And a lot of these country lanes and structures served as suitable stand-ins for some of the well-known buildings within Gettysburg itself. If you ever have the opportunity to watch the director's cut of Gettysburg, which adds about 20 or so additional minutes to the film, as if it wasn't long enough, there are some scenes in which General Buford's troops interact with the civilian population of Gettysburg. The scene that we just saw here, as the 20th Maine is crossing the Mason-Dixon line, we get the only line from a female character in the entire film, who is actually portrayed by Ron Maxwell, the director's daughter.
I thought the war was in Virginia.
You can offer a critique of the movie, saying that, it overlooks the civilian experience, but I think the strength of the movie is that it sticks very, very closely to the book. It doesn't digress too much at all, and it follows the main characters that were featured in The Killer Angels. And unfortunately, this was not the case for the film's prequel, Gods and Generals. In the background, we see a fairly good recreation of the Lutheran Theological Seminary. The actual building is a little bit bigger, but it looks a good bit like the one that still stands along Route 30 in Gettysburg today. And the reason why they could not film many of these scenes there was simply because there were too many modern intrusions in roads and houses that surrounded it. And so they had to partially rebuild the Lutheran Theological Seminary and kind of had to have it, out on its own where there weren't a lot of buildings enveloping it.
When our people get here, Lee will have the high ground. There'll be the devil to pay. The high ground.
I really enjoy this scene with General Buford as he is talking to his staff members. Because once again, it shows how the wheels are turning inside the heads of these generals. And certainly there was a lot of weight on General Buford's shoulders at this given moment as his men ride into town on the final day of June 1863. And Buford is deserving of a lot of credit because he determined that this terrain surrounding Gettysburg was incredibly valuable. If you visualize a wagon wheel, Gettysburg is like the hub on that wheel, and all the roads going out of it are the spokes. And ultimately, it was the need to secure this road network that will bring these tens of thousands of men bearing down upon this formerly peaceful college and agricultural community. If you ever have the chance to go visit Gettysburg, I would recommend that you go up onto one of the pieces of elevation that is known as Oak Hill. And from there you can see how Gettysburg sits within a geographic bowl. It is surrounded by all of these pieces of high elevation. And certainly John Buford was taking this terrain into consideration as he is preparing to fight what will become known as a delaying action. Buford realizes that he himself and his force of slightly under 3,000 cavalrymen, they won't be able to hold off the entirety of the Confederate Army. Their mission here in late June and early July is to buy time until the rest of the Army of the Potomac can arrive, and perhaps a bigger battle will unfold from there. And so this is the supreme decision that Buford makes, that this will be the place to fight a battle.
The Rebs will hit us just about first light. Keep a clear eye. Have the pickets give us a good...
Although these Federal cavalrymen would be drastically outnumbered, they had also a number of advantages at their disposal. Chiefly, they were among the best armed troops to be found in either army. They had rapid-fire carbines, they had cavalry sabers, they had pistols, and then their fourth weapon is the horse itself. And, you know, if you have a half-ton beast charging at you, you would be hard-pressed not to move and to dodge it. And so how Buford and his men would fight this delaying action is that 3 of his troopers would be on the firing line, and a few yards behind that, the 4th man would be holding the horses. They'd be able to fire a few shots, and they would be able to displace, fall back, stop and go. Using hit and run tactics, Buford's men were acting as a human speed bump to break up the Confederate advance.
The enemy pickets are within 4 miles of my position. Rumor says Ewell is coming over the mountains from Carlisle.
In this scene that we see here with Buford outside the Lutheran Theological Seminary, this is one of the scenes where the actual building is used. And they have this rather tight close-up shot of General Buford writing some correspondence where they were able to remove a lot of the modern obstruction. And so we can see here that some actual historical structures that witnessed the battle were incorporated into this film.
Bow down thy heaven, O Lord, and come down, touch the mountains, and they shall smoke.
It's important to note that Robert E. Lee reportedly was not in the best of health during the Gettysburg campaign. He had been having chest pain. Some people suggest that he was also having chronic diarrhea during the campaign as well. And one must wonder, how did this afflict his strategic thinking as the Battle of Gettysburg opened in some of its initial phases and in the days that followed? And it's certainly an interesting question to consider. That band in the background is definitely not playing for real.
I have reports of Union cavalry in Gettysburg. Cavalry? Virginia Hill reports only militia.
Something that's not really mentioned in the film is that Confederates had already been through Gettysburg. They had marched through the town on June 26, 1863, and on that day, they by and large confiscated anything of military value. Clothing, food, whiskey. The Confederate Army also captured perhaps 1,000 free African Americans who were living in south central Pennsylvania. And so there was kidnapping, and you call human trafficking, going on here in Pennsylvania during this time. And kind of these broader scavenging endeavors only get a very cursory mention here in some of these scenes. One of the great myths of the Battle of Gettysburg, and this is something that is even, presented in Ken Burns' series on the Civil War, is that Gettysburg began over a large shoe supply that was located in the town. And that is not at all whatsoever true. There never was a large shoe supply. And even if there had been, it would have been quickly, taken over on June 26th, several days before. This story of the shoes was a myth, a cover-up story propagated by General Henry Heath to essentially cover up his tracks for some of his blunders that he makes on July 1st, 1863. And it's a myth that stands very strong to this very day, these 160 years later. The opening shots of the Battle of Gettysburg are fired somewhere around 7 or 7:30 in the morning. There was a young lieutenant of the 8th Illinois Cavalry by the name of Marcellus Jones who had the distinction of firing the opening shot. This was a few miles west down the Chambersburg Pike, and slowly but surely the fight gravitates closer and closer to town, which is what we see in these scenes here.
Lovely. Lovely.
A very nice recreation here, which is actually a painted backdrop of the town of Gettysburg, and that is based off of an 1863 black and white photograph. And so we get this sense from a modest distance that there is a community here, but we don't get much more of a glance than that. In these opening phases of the fight, Buford's cavalrymen were perhaps outnumbered like 8 or 9 to 1. But once again, the Confederates don't have a very firm idea of what is in front of them, how many men they are facing off with. Buford's men have a fairly good sense of the terrain. They were gathering intelligence from the local population. And they were in this defensive arc on both the northern and western edge of town. When you're on the defense here too, that is often a slightly easier proposition.
It'll take them a while to get online.
Yes, sir, but Hill's whole corps is behind, maybe 25,000. Longstreet behind that. Ewell over there to the north.
The Battle of Gettysburg, like so many battles throughout history, it's a story of action followed by reaction. And once it becomes apparent that there is this major brawl afoot in Gettysburg, it's kind of like knocking down the dominoes. As more Confederates are called forth to concentrate on Cashtown and Gettysburg, more Federal troops are going to respond in kind. And by the end of the first day of the battle, there will be over 50,000 men in Gettysburg, and 1 out of every 3 of them will become a casualty. Another flaw with Ken Burns' interpretation of the battle is that it calls July 1st a minor skirmish in comparison of what is to come. And that is not true at all. July 1st, 1863, all by itself, is one of the bloodiest days of the American Civil War. Here at the Cashtown Inn, we see yet another instance where an actual historical structure is being incorporated. At the time of the battle, it did not have the side porch that we see here, but otherwise it is a time capsule sort of moment. They put mulch and dirt down on the concrete road that is in front of the hotel, and you can still book a room there and get a fine meal at the Cashtown Hotel to this very day. We see Lee meeting with General A.P. Hill, who was said to have a red shirt that he wore into battle. That too may be a myth. But here too we can see that these forces are consolidating west of town. As we see the artillery pieces firing here, there's not much of a recoil to them. Because usually when these guns are fired, originally, they maybe had like 2 or 3 pounds of black powder in them. Civil War reenactors today use substantially less black powder than that when they fire these guns, but even less was used in the movie, I was told by a reenactor who was in it, because they took into consideration all of the horses that were on set, and they didn't want all these guns recoiling and the booms to be, really, really thunderous. And so the interest of keeping the animals calm on set, there's not much of a recoil or not as much boom to the artillery pieces as there would have been in real life.
Fucking fire!
It would be so hard to film a movie like this today. The ranks of Civil War reenactors have really dwindled in the years since. There was just a lot of zeitgeist, here in the late 80s and the early 90s, I think, as the baby boomer generation was looking for a unique history hobby to have. And most of this would be CGI today, but there's no CGI in this film whatsoever. And in my mind, that's one of the reasons why it has aged relatively well, is that you had a lot of these people for whom this movie was a passion project. A lot of them believed in standards of authenticity, and it's filmed in the real place.
Sir, it's General Reynolds.
With the arrival of General Reynolds here, in the background we can see Little Round Top and Big Round Top, as well as some of the farm structures. And this scene depicts General Reynolds coming up the Emmitsburg Road, in which his 1st Corps was soon to follow.
Lovely ground. Now let's go surprise Harry Heath.
The 1st Corps, commanded by a Pennsylvanian by the name of John F. Reynolds, arrived shortly before 10 a.m. on July 1st. And this was a shocking revelation to the various Confederate brigades who were attacking Buford's cavalrymen. And it was at that moment that there was this realization that they weren't merely facing off with Union cavalry or Pennsylvania militia. The Army of the Potomac had arrived in earnest, and the fight was soon to escalate as a result.
Go on, General.
Well, sir, they wouldn't leave. My boys got the dam up. We deployed the whole division and went after them.
Robert E. Lee had given orders to his commanders not to bring on a general engagement until the Army of Northern Virginia was fully concentrated, and where these Southern troops could wage a battle on their own terms on ground of their own choosing. But a lot of the responsibility for the blossoming of this battle as it unfolds rests on the shoulders and the responsibility of General Henry Heath, who, as his character admits here, he and his men got their dander up. And once they got into this fight, they were not going to be easily turned back or redeploy or withdraw or what have you. And so, like I said, in this chain reaction fashion, the Battle of Gettysburg further escalates. And once Lee's troops were committed, as the fighting persists hour by hour, it is going to become more and more difficult for Robert E. Lee to recall his troops and get he and his men back on the track that they had originally envisioned. Once again, in comparison to movies like Saving Private Ryan, which was made only 5 years after this. The violence in this film is quite tame. The Battle of Gettysburg was horribly gruesome. And when you read various first-person accounts, there are men with their jaws being ripped off, their bowels being eviscerated. Horrible, horrible carnage ensued there. But once again, you have to keep in mind that this film was meant to be a television movie. You could not have excessive or gratuitous violence in a television miniseries in the early 1990s like you can today. And so that is one reason why the violence in this movie is comparatively tame. But as I said, the plus side to that is that it has been made accessible to many a history and social studies classrooms in the years since. The Federal troops that we see entering the field here are members of the Iron Brigade, which consisted of various regiments from Michigan, Indiana, and Wisconsin. These men, in some cases, were rough and tough frontiersmen. They wore these large hardy hats as their distinctive image. And some of the regiments within the Iron Brigade were absolutely pummeled as they were involved in General Reynolds' counterattack, which took place perhaps around 10:30 in the morning on July 1st. There are some units that were fighting in this area known as the Herbst Woods. They lost 75, 80% of their men. It was an absolute bloodbath. This scene, too, it has my favorite song of the soundtrack, and I know that's true for many people who watch this film. It's important to note, you see a lot of underbrush in this scene, and in reality, all of this would have been chewed away by the livestock that were living here at the time. When you look at a lot of the period photos of the Herbst Woods, there's very little vegetation to be found in a lot of cases.
Forward! For God's sake, forward!
But it is here at this moment where General Reynolds, who had been offered command of the Army of the Potomac not too long before, is instantly shot dead off of his horse. And it did not bode well for the Union Army on the first day of the battle to have this very high-ranking general killed at this early phase of combat. Reynolds was the ultimate soldier. He was this stalwart West Pointer. He was engaged to be married. And his would-be widow, who was deeply affected by her love's lost, ended up joining a convent, became a nun for the rest of her life. Never even considered, marrying another man. And so that too is something important to keep in mind, that we see not only people dying in the film, there are not only soldiers dying on the battlefield, but as is the case with every war, people back home who never heard a shot being fired in anger were dramatically affected as well. The film also shows Reynolds being killed by a sharpshooter, a Confederate rifleman with a large scope on his rifle. This too is one of the great myths of the Battle of Gettysburg. There is really no evidence to suggest that Reynolds was killed by a marksman in such a manner. But it's one of these slight embellishments just to add another degree of drama to a story that is already really compelling. And I think the rationale behind that storyline is that this great general had to be killed by a great marksman, and we see that being reflected here in the film.
Long, sir. We got over 20 miles today.
We got over 100 miles in 5 days.
It was not uncommon for soldiers on either side to march 10, 15, perhaps 20 miles per day. And as you can very well imagine, marching around in the humidity of Virginia, Maryland, or Pennsylvania in July could be quite a grueling experience. Now, all that said, Civil War soldiers wore wool essentially every day of their lives. They are far more accustomed to wearing this thick material than you or I would be on a daily basis today. So that's something interesting to keep in mind.
Colonel Vincent, sir. Professor Chamberlain. A far cry from Bowdoin College, wouldn't you say?
No farther than Harvard Yard?
Indeed.
And here we are introduced to Colonel Strong Vincent. And Strong Vincent was a graduate of Harvard University. He was from Erie, Pennsylvania. There's a high school in Erie, Pennsylvania that is named in his honor. And like Chamberlain, you know, he's an academic. You know, he is not a textbook soldier. He did not go to West Point. But both of these men are very learned individuals. They learn the school of the soldier very quickly, and they are going to put that knowledge to good use in the coming days' fight. Just a few days before the Battle of Gettysburg, Strong Vincent pens a letter to his wife back in Erie, Pennsylvania. And, you know, he essentially says, you know, if I am to die on my home soil of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, it could not be for a better cause. And that in so many ways underscores the importance of union, the idea of saving democracy and representative government in the eyes of these federal troops.
Find General Ewell telling the federal troops are withdrawn in confusion. It is only necessary to push those people in order to gain possession of those heights. Tell him to take that hill if practicable.
Indeed, in the afternoon of July 1st, the Union Army's 1st Corps and 11th Corps are pushed back from their positions on the northern and western edge of town. And what had been a battle that had been going from field to field and woodlot to woodlot now becomes a fight that is going from street to street and house to house, with Gettysburg's civilian population trapped in the middle. These scenes of urban combat were almost filmed at another national park, Harper's Ferry National Historical Park, where I also worked at for a short time, because it still retained that 19th century ambience. But I suspect the budget was getting rather tight. They did not have the ability to move production to another state to recreate those scenes. And therefore, the street fighting within Gettysburg is completely omitted from the film.
Maybe we should not have fought here?
I know that, but we have prevailed. The men have prevailed.
Yes, sir, they have always done that, but in the morning...
Sentiments to this extent were later encapsulated by General James Longstreet in his post-war memoirs. And these post-war writings of General Longstreet, who lived a good 30 years past Robert E. Lee, got him into a lot of hot water with Confederate veterans who wanted to fully abide by these lost cause tendencies that, you know, elevated Robert E. Lee to sainthood. And so in addition to that, as well as some political decisions on Longstreet's part in regard to Reconstruction, which we'll discuss a little bit later, in some ways he became persona non grata among some of his Confederate veterans. And, you know, it's really not until this movie comes out that I think a lot of Civil War buffs took a more sympathetic view toward James Longstreet. For many decades prior to this, he had been considered a scapegoat of the Battle of Gettysburg, much of which was completely unjustified. But we will get into some of these historical memory games a little bit later on in a future segment. Oh, we see a little bit of modernity here behind the Chamberlain brothers, where you can see a jet stream going through the air. The Confederacy definitely could have used an Air Force at this battle, though.
Hello, man. What outfit you with?
Archer's Brigade, Heath Division.
This scene is based off of a painting by Winslow Homer, and you see this same painting in the opening credits of the film. And it shows these three tattered Confederate soldiers conversing with who I believe is General Francis Barlow in the painting, another veteran of Gettysburg. And here he is replaced by Tom Chamberlain. And it's a rather good visual moment in the film.
I'm fighting for my rats. All of us here, that's what we're fighting for. For your what? For our rats.
The primary rats that they are fighting for is to own human property. And if you have any doubt about this, all you need to do is to look at the Confederate Articles of Secession from the winter and spring of 1860, 1861, where the Confederate States make perfectly clear that their cause is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery. And these little declarations of independence that each southern state made, all of them are perfectly clear. Abraham Lincoln is elected. Abraham Lincoln threatens the growth of slavery. Therefore, we do not want to abide by the perfectly legal results of a presidential election. Therefore, we are going to start our own country called the Confederate States of America. So, if you have any doubt, that's what this is all about.
Did you get his name?
He said something I couldn't understand. Head Colonel, I can't understand anyone south of Mason-Dixon, Rebs or darkies.
This scene with a freedom-seeking slave, in my mind, is one of the more frustrating scenes in the film. Because, Chamberlain, he's an abolitionist. He talks about the evils of slavery early on. Slavery needed to be destroyed in order to preserve the Union. Yet, the sole African-American character in the film is left completely voiceless. Now, one could argue that he is, his character is recovering from the trauma that he has endured. I think that is what the film is trying to suggest. But, even giving that actor a few lines could have really brought this very important issue to the forefront. And I think it is a perspective that Civil War films should have. And so I think it's a very big missed opportunity here, just to kind of give this obligatory nod to this freedom-seeking slave, or perhaps he was a free black man living in Pennsylvania who had fled the wrath of the Confederate Army. And so definitely a missed opportunity.
The thing is, you cannot judge a race. Any man who judges by the group is a peewit.
This is a very progressive, forward-thinking view on the part of Buster Kilrain. It is well known that the Irish were not very fond of African Americans in Civil War America. And the predominant reason why that is so is because Irish immigrants and African Americans often vied for the same jobs, which were often at the lowest tiers of society. And the perfect representation or example of this tension that existed between Irishmen and African Americans took place in New York City only about 2 weeks after the Battle of Gettysburg, in the form of the New York City draft riots, in which the Irishmen of that city rose up against the draft, against President Lincoln, and they targeted the African American population of that city. Something which is very vividly captured in Martin Scorsese's film Gangs of New York, which perhaps we will also look at a future point. And so, perhaps this conversation is a little bit ahistorical, but cinematically and from a literary perspective, it offers a certain degree of moral alignment for the characters as they discuss, what is this war all about? What does it say about we as a society? What does it suggest about us as men of honor who are fighting in a noble cause? And in that way, it is a very evocative scene. And of course, it brings about the phrase, the killer angels, as well, which delves into itself some of the moral complexity that these characters confront.
Which is why I'm here. I'll be treated as I deserve, not as my father deserved.
This conversation between Chamberlain and Kilrain sitting under this tree, which is quite poetic when you think about it, if anything, it's an exclamation point of Chamberlain's speech that he delivers to the 2nd Maine Mutineers a little bit earlier. Just in case you had any doubt what these guys are fighting for, this scene underscores that point.
Good Lord, George, what does that smell?
That's meat. Ain't it lovely?
Whoa.
You got it off a dead Frenchman.
Here we see the introduction of one of the more colorful characters in the film, a Confederate division commander by the name of George Pickett, wonderfully portrayed by actor Stephen Lang, who I actually had the opportunity to work with on a documentary project called The Gettysburg Story in 2012 and 2013. And here is an actor who is very invested in the story and the history of the Battle of Gettysburg. He returns there to the park almost on an annual basis, and he gives lectures and performances and participates in fundraising and so on and so forth. And in his mind, he's been in Tombstone, Avatar, a lot of other really notable films. But I really think that this is one of the prime roles of his career. I think that's how he feels about it, and his connection to Gettysburg as a place, I think, is testimony to that.
General Pickett, Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Fremantle of Her Majesty's venerable and elite Coldstream Guards, Britain's military attaché.
Arthur Fremantle, much like Buster Kilrain, is a literary device because he's an outsider, like we, the audience, are outsiders to these people and their conversations. And Fremantle is very important in this regard because his presence allows these Confederate officers to explain themselves, explain why they are fighting, what are their definitions of honor, so on and so forth. In reality, Arthur Fremantle, he was not here in the Gettysburg campaign in any sort of formal capacity. He was not the eyes and ears of Queen Victoria per se, as is depicted in the film. He was more of a tourist. And he wrote an amazing diary. He kept an amazing journal that was published in the year 1864. You can find it on Google Books for free to read. And Arthur Fremantle he's kind of like the Forrest Gump of 1863 America. Breaks his way through the blockade, ends up in Mexico, goes through Texas, witnesses a portion of the Vicksburg campaign, goes up through the Carolinas, sees Fort Sumter being attacked by the Union naval blockade, continues working his way up the East Coast, makes his way to Richmond, Virginia, meets Jefferson Davis and all these Confederate laureates, and then he's given the opportunity to join Robert E. Lee's army as it goes on the march north. He joins them, he witnesses the campaign, he witnesses the battle. After the Confederates are defeated at Gettysburg, he parts ways, he goes through western Maryland, works his way up to Pittsburgh, cuts through the center of Pennsylvania, goes to Philadelphia, moves up to New York, and there he witnesses the draft riots that I mentioned just a little bit earlier before he gets a boat back to England. That is one hell of a journey, and boy did he see a lot of history along the way. That is the story of Arthur Fremantle.
You've got to tell them that what we're fighting for here is freedom from what we consider to be the rule of a foreign power. I mean, that's all we want. That's what this war is all about.
It's important to point out during these conversations about states' rights that, role of foreign power and so on and so forth, the power of the presidency. Slave-holding Southerners had almost a complete monopoly on the control of the federal government from the very beginning of the United States government up until the 1850s, for the most part. They had a majority of the presidencies. There were a majority of slave owners consistently on this bench of the Supreme Court, and Southerners also had an edge in the representation game in Congress as well. And so all of this, bereavement about, Confederates, not having any say in government or anything like that is a bunch of malarkey. They had controlled the federal government for decades prior to this moment. And finally, when it didn't go their way and when Abraham Lincoln was elected, they said, sayonara, we're seceding, bye-bye. The production design here is just so stellar. Here we see a recreation of the little humble whitewashed farmhouse of local widow Lydia Leister, who lived here along the Taneytown Road just behind the federal lines on Cemetery Ridge. And everything is perfect. We see the Abraham Bryan farmhouse and barn further up the ridge. As is true to form, the homestead is on this slight depression going down from Cemetery Ridge. It's just a very faithful recreation of the landscape and the buildings. And so top-notch scouting location for the people who were involved in this production.
General Hancock?
How are you, John?
I'm all right. Brigades are pretty shot up, though.
Winfield Scott Hancock was known as Hancock the Superb. This very tall, much taller than actor Brian Mallon, who portrays him here. Tall, loud, vocal, swore a lot, always wore these bright white starch shirts underneath his dress uniform that popped out very vibrantly from his collar and sleeves. And Hancock was the man who rallied the Union forces by and large on Cemetery Hill after they retreated through town in the late afternoon, early evening of July 1st, 1863. And he would be commanding a good portion of the men who would find themselves on Cemetery Ridge the 2 subsequent days of the battle. And so as the 2nd Corps commander, he was a very vital figure. It's a very graceful and poignant exit on the part of General Buford, who's so magnificently portrayed by Sam Elliott.
General Trimble is waiting. Will you see him now?
Very well, Major.
Robert E. Lee's headquarters was located at the home of a 69-year-old widow by the name of Mary Thompson, who lived right along the Chambersburg Pike on the western outskirts of Gettysburg. And this building that was the exterior that was used for that is actually another historical farmstead located at the base of Big Round Top that is known as the Slider Farm, where members of the United States sharpshooters were engaged in a rather fierce skirmish in the afternoon and evening of July 2nd, 1863. And so here we see one historical building being used to represent another. Kind of interesting. And they do have some physical similarity.
General Trimble.
Sir, I most respectfully request another assignment.
General Isaac Trimble had previously been an engineer on the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. And here in this conversation comes up a very heated point that leads to one of the great what-ifs of the Battle of Gettysburg. One of the questions that I was often asked when I was a park ranger at Gettysburg was what would have happened if General Jackson, Stonewall Jackson, had been at Gettysburg? And my thought always was, well, he would have smelled really bad because he was 2 months dead. It's not really helpful to be, engaging in these sort of hypotheticals. It didn't happen, we'll never know what happened. It's mind games. It's like science fiction. It doesn't matter. But, all that said, one of the great controversies, is behind the perceived sluggishness or cautiousness of General Richard Ewell in not attacking Cemetery Hill on the southern edge of Gettysburg after this desperate fight through the streets of the town itself. And I tend to have a fairly sympathetic view toward General Ewell because there are all these things that he had to take into consideration and he didn't know the answers to. How many Federals are up there? How much artillery do they have? Are they dug in? Do I have enough men to assault that position? How much ammunition do we have? How much daylight is left? And so on and so on and so on. He doesn't have answers to any of these questions. And ultimately, the blame rests with Robert E. Lee because he gave incredibly poor, vague orders. He tells General Ewell, take that hill if practicable. What in the hell does that mean, if practicable? You either tell the guy to take the hill or not to take the hill. Leaving that sort of vague discretion up to a general and, you know, these moments of uncertainty and desperation can lead to a lot of finger pointing in the historical record later on. And of course, that is ultimately what happens. And General Ewell, much like General Longstreet, in some ways becomes a scapegoat of the battle. But really, if any finger pointing is to be done, it's back to Robert E. Lee because he was the guy making the calls.
General Meade, sir.
Hancock. It's so damn dark out there, I can't see a thing.
Another one of the unfortunate aspects of the narrative is that General George Meade has only one scene in this movie. He's almost like this secondary or tertiary character. When, you know, he had just as many important command decisions to make as Robert E. Lee. His role in the battle was just as dramatic. And he gets like 30 seconds in the movie. And it's unfortunate that we don't see more of his perspective throughout the film. And certainly, you know, Chamberlain's character makes up for that to a large extent. But George Gordon Meade is one of the absolute best generals in American history. I'm saying he should have gotten his due a little bit more. You know, even to this very day, you know, a lot of people think that Ulysses Grant defeated Robert E. Lee at Gettysburg. And so Meade is a guy who never really got his due credit. He had his own detractors within the Union Army. Meade died just a few years after the Civil War, a fairly young man. He never had the opportunity to, you know, write thorough reminiscences or memoirs. Never got to, you know, hit the lecture circuit like a lot of Civil War generals did. And for that reason, he's sometimes obscure and overlooked. So we should acknowledge this man for what he did, because ultimately he would do something that no other Union general had thoroughly done up until this point. He soundly defeated Robert E. Lee. And he did so not because Lee merely made a bunch of mistakes, but because Meade was a good general. So now that we have reached nightfall on the evening of July 1st, 1863, we are going to start to bring this episode to a close. Join us in the next segment of Real History as we dive into the combat, command decisions, and personalities that will define the second day of the Battle of Gettysburg, one of the most important days in American history. We'll see you next time. If you don't like these comments, feel free to secede from this channel.